he be going to work?
I had this party after Heezy was off the hook.
What the heck does that mean?
20 years ago, one school board in one city passed one little resolution. And America spent the next 6 months saying stuff like this.
This is a political correctness that simply has gone out of control.
The year was 1996. The city was Oakland, and the resolution was about African American vernacular English. But that's not what most people called it. They called it
Ebonics.
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 And what the school board wanted to do was recognize it as a language. Why? Because to the board, Ebonics wasn't a dialect. It wasn't slang. And the students who spoke it weren't struggling to speak English correctly. They were bilingual. White America was not thrilled. Almost immediately, state legislatures around the country passed laws banning schools from teaching Ebonics. Legislators in Oklahoma declared a state of emergency and called Ebonics a threat to health and safety. The Secretary of Education said it was a terrible thing to teach. Congress held a hearing.
Ebonics is a non-standard form of English.
Oakland, after all, seemed to be doing something radical. From now on, we were told, kids who spoke Ebonics wouldn't have to learn standard English. And kids who didn't speak Ebonics would learn it as a foreign language, like it was French or Spanish.
Teaching African American students, quote, in their primary language. Isn't that inflammatory?
Sure enough, may be cute on one side of town, but I could not write an essay with sure enough at the university level.
The only problem was, that's not what Oakland was doing, like, at all. They simply wanted to teach standard English in a way their students would understand. And you know what? The rest of the country should have let them. Because the thing we've learned about Ebonics in the 20 years since we all freaked out about it is that bringing it into the classroom works. It was a good idea then, and it's a good idea now. So, let's define some terms. What actually is Ebonics? Essentially, it's the speech pattern of many, but not all, African Americans. It began to distinguish itself from Standard English during slavery, then got even more distinct during Reconstruction and segregation.
It's more different from Standard English than any other dialect spoken in continental North America.
Here, take this phrase. Most white people see this. But what the sentence actually means is this. Or take this one. In Standard English, the two negatives cancel each other out. In Ebonics, they intensify each other.
That's just bad English, isn't it?
No, it's not. Dozens of other languages have these same structures. They're not incorrect. They just have a different set of rules than Standard English. That's why, among people who study languages for a living, Ebonics is completely uncontroversial.
It's not simply slang or grammatical mistakes, but a well-formed set of rules of pronunciation and grammar that's capable of conveying complex logic and reasoning.
I still speak Ebonics. Every day I play golf, we get down.
Let's go back to Oakland. In 1996, teachers and administrators were concerned about the achievement gap in their schools.
African American students have an average GPA of 1.8.
The district formed a task force of teachers, parents, and academics and gave them the job of studying Oakland schools and coming up with ways to fix them. After 6 months, the task force delivered its recommendations. It was all common sense stuff, things like adopting new criteria for special ed, hiring more black teachers, and increasing funding. And this team, the one formed specifically to help African American students, its #1 recommendation was to recognize Ebonics as a language. The reason why is simple and still important. At the time, the way most American schools taught English was by correcting students who spoke Ebonics.
Whew, you guys will be reading poetry soon.
African American students were told over and over again that their way of speaking was wrong and that Standard English was right. The task force wanted to try a different approach. Instead of telling students that the way they spoke was incorrect, teachers should start asking them, hey, how would you say this in Standard English? This method is called Contrastive Analysis, and here's what it looks like.
Last night, we baked cookies.
No, it's past tense. Yeah, past tense. I got it.
Are you ready? Okay. #1, what language is it in?
AAL.
It is an African American language. #2, what linguistic feature is in AAL?
Past tense marker, ED.
Past tense marker, ED. That's 2. And How do you code switch it into mainstream American English?
Last night we baked cookies.
You got 500 more points.
Pretty harmless, right? By the mid-90s, study after study was showing that this is a more effective way to teach standard English.
We don't need to teach African American language. They already know it.
Yeah. That's why Oakland wanted to recognize Ebonics as a language. It wasn't about giving up on formal writing or teaching white kids to speak Ebonics. They simply wanted to teach their students the difference between how they spoke and how they would have to write on exams and essays. In 1996, teachers, administrators, even students tried explaining that to the rest of the country, but nothing seemed to matter. The Ebonics Controversy sounds like a long time ago, but it did lasting damage to American education. A study in 2012 profiled a fourth grader we'll call George. On a language test, George's teacher asked him to produce a few sentences in the past tense, so he did. To the teacher, these sentences were wrong. She marked them as incorrect and told George that he was failing as a reader. But those sentences aren't wrong. Ebonics has different rules for past tense and conjugation than standard English. George was simply answering in the language he speaks at home, what he's used to hearing. For decades, we've known that African American students are disadvantaged by teachers and tests that don't take language into account.
Standard English. Mark the toy that is behind the sofa. Ebonics version. Mark the toy that is in back of the couch. 2, Standard English version. Point to the squirrel that is beginning to climb the tree. The Ebonics version. Point to the squirrel that is fixing to climb the tree. These changes produce dramatic changes in the children's test scores.
In other words, kids who speak standard English at home can answer test questions with the language that sounds natural to them. Kids who speak Ebonics at home have to work harder. Looking back now, 20 years later, the depressing lesson of the Ebonics controversy is about the nature of power in America. When white people want to do something experimental in education, it's called charter schools or Montessori or experiential learning. When black people do it, it's called identity politics or political correctness gone mad. After the congressional hearing, Oakland released an updated resolution that removed every mention of the word Ebonics. Since then, no district has tried anything that ambitious for meeting the needs of its African American students. The problem was never the way that black students talk. The problem is that the rest of the country still hasn't found a way to listen.